Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we are reading issue number 160, and just a little catch-up on what's been going on. This story arc has taken place in a bar or diner in the middle of nowhere in the south, and a blizzard has rolled in and trapped everybody inside. Now, at first, John isn't there, but after a while, he actually walks in from the blizzard, and at first it seems like everybody's going to be nice to him, but John basically acts like an asshole to a couple of them as they tried to be nice, so everybody's kind of standoffish about him. And then with all that ill will, someone actually finds a dead body outside that was stabbed by an icicle, and people are, of course, suspicious of John because they don't know him, even though they might not know some of the other people that are in the bar. Those people have families and stuff. They didn't come mysteriously out of the blizzard and appear out of nowhere. So we have a guy who's been murdered by an icicle. There's also one of the people saying that it's this local legend called the Iceman that did it. So as everybody's trying to figure out what to do with this dead body, and also maybe who did it, in the last issue we had 3 guys walk in who were from out of town. They were definitely criminals of some sort, and one of them has been shot in the stomach. And at first they were kind of playing it low-key, like, oh, he's got a stomach ache, it's no big deal, we're just from out of town. But unfortunately, as these 3 men were discussing what was to be done and how they were going to get out of here, their conversation was interrupted by one of the old guys named Rudy at the bar, and so they had to threaten him. And then when he came out of the bathroom, he was trying to warn one of the other patrons to leave, and Waylon, the leader of the 3 men, heard him, and at the very end of the last issue, he raised the gun, and we don't see it, but we hear the gun fire. So coming into this issue, we're kind of assuming that he killed Rudy, or maybe one of the other patrons. So that's where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with issue 160, we got the cover, and just like the last ones, there is a motif of a background image and then some images floating over it. So the background image is of a man dead in the snow with an icicle in his back, and another kneeling man behind him kind of looking at him. And then we get a wide horizontal panel at the top of John smoking, and then we get 3 panels going down vertically of some of the people in the diner, presumably. But you can't really tell because they look a little bit different than they do in the actual comic. And also on the cover, we see that this is written by Brian Azzarello with art by Marcelo Fruchin. And as we turn to the first page, we start off right where we ended, with Waylon having fired the gun, and it turns out he did not kill anybody. He actually shot above everyone into the skull of a deer that was hanging on a post. And as of right now, everybody is inside except for John and Pete, who went outside at the end of the last issue, and they heard the gunshot from out there. And then Dwight and Lamar were still in the restroom when the shot went off. So we see Dwight come out with his gun drawn, and he says, "What the fuck was that, Waylon?" And Waylon, who's still holding his gun on everybody, says, "An accident." And then Hope, the Asian woman behind the bar, asks, "Are you some kind of crazy?" And Waylon gives her a side glance and smirks and says, "Yeah." And then Keith, the bartender, holds up his hands and says, "Okay, let's put the guns down, boys." But Dwight just looks down at his gun and he says, "Shit." And then it's like he made a decision in his mind because he holds up the gun and says, "Nobody fucking moves." Then we see Lamar come out of the restroom behind him, and he's the man who's been shot. So he's holding his stomach, and he also has a gun pointed out, and he asks, "What's going on?" And Waylon answers, "Gramps over here's got a big mouth, so now everybody's in big trouble." And Rudy, the old man, tries to protest, saying, "I didn't." But Waylon sticks the gun in his face and says, "Shut the fuck up." And then Dwight points his gun at everybody else and says, "All of you, over there." But nobody moves, so he clenches his teeth and he says, "Now, goddammit." And I guess this shows everybody that maybe he will shoot them if they don't move. So everybody goes to sit down at the booths, except one person. The trucker does not move, and he just stands there looking at them stone-faced and doesn't say anything. But Dwight puts his gun in his face and says, "What, you big and stupid? Got me something here, fix that for you right quick." And then we can assume he kind of shakes the gun to bring attention to it. And that seems to work because the trucker very angrily walks back to the booths and goes to sit down. And as he does, Lamar says, "This is bad." And Dwight, who's still pointing his gun at the back of the trucker, says, "No shit, And then he says to everybody as the trucker sits down, "All you folks, keep your hands on the table where we can see them." And Lamar says to him, "We don't have any need for hostages, Dwight." And Dwight turns to him and smiles and says, "Hostages? They ain't hostages." But Waylon cuts in and says, "Like hell, boss. They are hostages. And Lamar's right. We don't need them." So I guess I was wrong there. I thought Waylon was in charge because he seemed to be taking the lead on everything, but I guess Dwight was the leader of this gang. So as Waylon says, "We don't need them," Lamar looks around and he thinks for a second and says, "Wait a minute. That fucker in the trench coat and that chubby guy." And Dwight looks at the people sitting down and asks, "Where they at?" And they all sit there kind of silent because they're freaked out that the guns are pointed at them. Or maybe they just don't want to say because they're hoping that John and Pete maybe went to go get help. But either way, Dwight's not happy that they're not answering, and he says, "I said, where they at?" And this time they still stay quiet, but they are starting to look at each other like maybe they should talk or they don't know what to do. So Waylon kind of forces their hand because he points his gun at them and they know he's willing to shoot. And he says, "Jesus, does anybody here know how to talk? 'Cause if you don't, you should know I like to shoot. What are them folks? The ones that can't speak. What are they called, Lamar?" And Lamar answers, "Dumb." And Waylon smiles and says, "Yeah, dumb people. I like to shoot dumb people." And because she's scared, Marnie, who's the mother of the two little girls, says, "Outside." And Waylon asks, "What?" And Marnie answers, "They went outside to look at the body of that poor man." And Jay, her husband, who's sitting next to her, says, "Marnie, don't." But she cuts him off and says, "Cooperate? For pity's sake, Jay, they have guns." And then Dwight points his gun at them and says, "Little lady's right, Jay." And as she was talking, I guess Waylon walked over to the door to look out the glass window, and he says to Dwight, "They ain't there no more, Dwight." And as he stares out into the blackness, Dwight says, "Course they're not. You hear a gunshot, you either run to see what it's all about, or you run away." And Waylon looks over to Dwight and asks, "You want I should follow their tracks?" And Dwight answers, "No, lock the door." And then he turns ominously to everybody and says, "So, who stuck that icicle in that fella anywho?" And as we turn the page, we cut to the outside, and we see John and Pete standing at the tree line talking to each other, and that's about 50 yards away from the building. And we see John has a fresh, unlit cigarette in his mouth, and he's saying to Pete, "All right, Pete, here's what's what. Obviously there's a problem. Some very bad men have come in from the cold. So despite the condition of the roads, you and I are forced to grasp the nettle and fetch the bill, right?" And Pete answers, "Geez, I think I don't know how we're going to do that." And then John points at the cars in the parking lot and asks, "You're going to drive. Which is yours?" And Pete answers, "I don't have a car. I come in with Hope and Keith." And as John lights his cigarette, he says, So, it's Shank's mare then." And then he begins to walk away, trudging through the snow, leaving Pete there. And John calls back, "Which way?" And then Pete starts to walk after him and says, "That way, but you're nuts. It's 13 miles to town. It'll take us like forever, if we even make it. You forgot, the Iceman is out tonight." And at that, John turns around and says, "The Iceman again. Pete, let me let you in on a little secret. There is no Iceman." And then they both turn and begin to walk down a snowy road in the direction that Pete pointed towards town. And Pete says to John, Geez, what do you know about the Iceman? You're not from around here." And John says, "Right you are, but I have been around." And as John says this, he's got a grin on his face that kind of says he's seen some shit. And he continues saying, "And I know a legend when I hear one. Your Iceman's no more real than Nessie or the Bigfoot." And Pete asks, "Bigfoot's not real?" And John answers, "Afraid not, sport. The Yeti, though." But then he cuts himself off, not finishing his sentence, and then he looks at Pete as they're walking and he says, "Pete, your fear of this Iceman, it's real, isn't it?" And Pete doesn't say anything, but he just kind of looks at him, and you can see the fear in Pete's expression. So it's like he's confirming what John asked. And then John gives a big grin and says, "Well then, let me let you in on another secret." And this just makes it kind of ominous, like John is either going to tell him that he is the Iceman and freak Pete out, or maybe John's going to use Pete's belief in this Iceman to do some kind of magic. But before we know what John is doing, we turn the page and we cut back inside the bar, and we see Waylon standing in front of one of the booths where the trucker, Hope, and Alma are sitting. And Waylon's pointing his gun at Hope, and he's giving her a funny look, and he asks, "Can't take your eyes off me, can you, honey?" But Hope doesn't say anything, and actually Alma turns to him and says, "Leave her alone." And then Waylon points his gun at her and says, "Not a chance." And we can see behind him in the shadows, there's something going on at one of the tables, and we cut to a panel of what's going on over there, and we see Dwight is holding two guns, his and Lamar's, and Lamar is sitting in a chair in pain, screaming out as Keith, the bartender, is looking at the wound, and Keith looks up at Dwight and says, "He's lost a lot of blood." And then Dwight sarcastically says, "He's sitting right here." And then we see Keith reach into a first aid kit and pull out some bandages and says, "Sorry. You're lucky, maybe. Damn thing tore right through you. If that thing was still in your gut somewhere, well, how'd you get shot anyway?" And as Keith cleans the wound with some gauze, Lamar answers, "Does it matter?" And Keith replies, "I suppose not." And then Keith stands up, and Dwight walks over to him and puts a gun in his side and asks, "Can you fix him up?" And Keith answers, "He needs a doctor." And then Dwight gets in front of him and puts his gun underneath Keith's chin and says, "He's got you." But Keith doesn't seem to care anymore. He just turns around and doesn't say anything. And Dwight says, "Hold it." But then Keith turns around and says, "I'm just going over to the bar, get some whiskey." And Dwight asks, "You need a drink?" And then Keith turns around and goes behind the bar. And as he does, he says, "No, he does. I'm going to have to clean that wound. It's going to hurt." And then Lamar chimes in sarcastically saying, "Worse than being shot?" And Keith answers, "Dunno. Never been shot myself." Then we see him reaching under the bar to get a bottle, presumably, but behind the bottles, we see there is a shotgun. And we can tell he's thinking about taking it, and he probably is about to, but then Lamar says, "Yo, Chief, get me rum, 151. And I guess that makes Keith change his mind because he grabs a bottle of Bacardi and walks back to Lamar and Dwight. And I guess it was a new bottle because he's kind of opening the top of it, and he says to Lamar, "Have a good long pull on this and I'll." But then there's a loud noise of a smack, and we cut back to the booth on the other side of the room where Waylon is backhanding Alma. And the woman screams out, of course, and the trucker who's sitting across from her yells, "Hey!" But before he can stand up or do anything, Waylon sticks the gun right in his face, pushing against his nose and says, "No." And then we can kind of tell what's going on because Hope just says, "I'll go." And Waylon says, "Well, all right then." And of course, Dwight is trying to figure out what's going on, so he asks Waylon, "What the hell?" And we see Waylon pull Hope out of the booth, and he pulls her close to him so that their midsections are touching. And he says to Dwight, "Shut your mouth, boss, and I'll tell you what. Tonight, we done committed robbery and murder. Might be more of that to come. On top, we got us some hostages. You got any fucking idea what that means? Well, let me tell you. We's either dead or stuck dying in prison for the rest of our motherfucking lives. Way I see it, rape don't mean shit to nothing but my dick bout now." And as he says this last line, Waylon turns Hope around so her back is to him, but he's still holding her close, and he puts his hand on her face, and it looks like he's groping her cheeks and mouth. It's very creepy. And to Waylon's apathy, Dwight says, "We're gonna get out of this fine." And Waylon says, "Yeah? And if we don't, I want my drawers smelling like Chinese food when Johnny Law comes a-calling. And if you're interested, seconds. You can bet your ass they'll be sloppy." And as he's saying this, he's forcing Hope to walk, and they're walking past Keith, who is Hope's husband, and Lamar, who's sitting down next to him. So of course, Keith is very angry at this, and he's got the bottle of Bacardi in his hands, and he changes his grip on it, so he's now grabbing the bottle from the top so it can be used like a club. And it looks like just as he's about to strike, Lamar whispers to him, "Don't. Listen to me. The most important thing is we get out of this alive. All of us. He wastes you. He won't leave no witnesses." And when Lamar says this, we get a panel of everybody at the booth looking horrified at what's about to happen to Hope. Then we turn the page and we cut back outside to John and Pete. And it looks like John has just told Pete something very disturbing because Pete has a 1,000-mile stare and John is just smiling at him. But no words are being said anymore. Pete is just staring ahead, not looking at John. And John pulls out a pack of cigarettes, but when he looks inside, there's no more cigarettes in there. So he crushes the pack and tosses it in the snow, and then he walks back towards the bar. And Pete doesn't move a muscle this whole time, so who knows what John told him. Then we turn the page and we cut back to the bar where we see Waylon pushing Hope through the back door where the kitchen is. And in the foreground, we see Lamar ask Keith, she's your woman, huh? And Keith looks like he's struggling internally, like he really wants to go save Hope, but he's trying to wrestle with that and possibly everybody dying if he does that. And he answers Lamar saying, she's been my wife for 7 years, since I got her out of a catalog, Cherry Blossoms, Philippine women seeking American men for love and marriage. I was so lonely. Was. And then he begins to tear up and continues saying, was. In 7 years, we've never gone to bed angry or woken up cold. If I can remember that, why is it I feel so goddamn guilty I ever opened that catalog? Then we turn the page and we cut to inside the kitchen where Waylon is starting to get handsy with Hope. He has her pressed against a stove and he is trying to lift up her shirt and unbutton her pants. And as he does, he says, you be good there, girlie, and I promise I will. But as he's focusing on removing her clothes, he doesn't notice that Hope's hand touches a pan that's on the stove, and when she feels the handle, her eyes open very wide because she has decided to defend herself, and she takes that pan and hits him in the face as hard as she can, and I guess the edge of the pan actually hits him in the eye, and so there's a big gash on his brow and his cheek around his eye. And as he falls backwards against the counter, he yells, fuck! And she takes advantage of him falling back to grab a knife and run back into the main bar. And as she gets through the door, Dwight sees her, and of course you probably heard Waylon yell, and he holds up his gun and points it at her and yells, motherfucking Jesus Christ in a chicken basket! And she's maybe like 2 feet away from him, and she's holding the knife up to him, trying to defend herself. And Keith is pretty close too, and he says, Hope! But he's cut off as we see in the background Waylon come through the kitchen door, and he's holding his head, and Dwight says, Waylon! And then Hope turns around to Waylon, and she holds the knife out towards him, and Waylon yells, you fucking bitch! But just to make things worse, we see Lamar topple over in pain, and he screams out, and Dwight, who's still holding his gun on Hope, side-eyes Lamar on the ground and asks, Lamar? Then we get a shot of everybody else at the tables, and Marnie freaks out at this, and she stands up and yells, don't shoot her! Then Keith calls out to Hope saying, baby! Then Waylon walks over next to Dwight, and they both point their guns at Hope, and Keith says to her, trying to calm her down, put the knife down. And we can hear the little girl screaming in the background, and Hope really doesn't want to put the knife down, obviously, but Keith continues to try, saying, please, God, please, because he knows if somebody dies in a shootout in here, these guys are going to kill everybody because they don't want witnesses. And I guess maybe Hope realizes this too because she sees the look in Keith's eyes. So she puts the knife down on the table, and right as she does, Waylon punches her in the face and knocks her out. And right at that moment, there's a knock on the bar entrance door. And Dwight, Waylon, and Lamar turn, and they look like they're thinking, who the fuck could this be? And we see Waylon go over to the door and look outside the glass, and he does not look too happy about this. And he opens the door, and we see a very snow-covered John Constantine smiling and looking at Waylon, and Waylon puts the gun in his face, and he says, get the fuck in here! And as John enters and dusts the snow off of his shoulders, Waylon continues saying, where you been, asshole? And John answers very straight-faced, admiring me handiwork. And as he says that, we see him notice Hope on the ground, but he doesn't show that he sees her. He's just kind of like side-eyeing her. And Keith is trying to help her up because I guess she's recovered from that hit. So John is trying to pretend like he doesn't care or doesn't see them, and he continues saying, you know, that bloke out there, the one with the icicle. And then he brings his hand up to his chest and curls his fingers around an imaginary icicle that would be there if he was that dead body. And he also has a very evil smile on his face as he does that. Then we cut to the people at the booths, and all of them are looking very scared, and we see Alma say, I knew he did it. And Rudy's saying, the Iceman. And John's probably heard them because he's giving a really big grin, and obviously this is part of his plan or something, but, you know, everybody else just thinks he's a murderer, and he seems to be getting a kick out of that. And John turns to Keith, and he asks, you sell cigarettes? Then we cut to the dead man with the icicle in his chest outside, and because it's been snowing this whole time, he's almost completely covered with snow. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. And next issue is the conclusion of this story arc, so we'll have to see how this all wraps up in that one. But if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.